Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à la conférence Proportionality Under Pressure, the Effects of AI on Targeting, qui va nous être présentée par Jessica Dorsey à ma droite ici. Donc, avant de vous la présenter, je vais quand même me présenter rapidement. Je m'appelle Simon Hogue, je suis professeur au département de sciences politiques ici à l'UQAM, chercheur en résidence à l'Observatoire des conflits multidimensionnels de la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand. Et je suis très, très heureux de vous accueillir à cet événement organisé par la Chaire, évidemment, mais aussi en collaboration avec le CRITIC, le Centre sur la gouvernance sécuritaire et de crise du Collège militaire royal de Saint-Jean. C'est mon ancien port d'attache et avec qui c'est toujours un plaisir, en fait, de travailler. Donc, aujourd'hui, c'est un honneur de recevoir Jessica Dorsey. Jessica est professeure de droit international et directrice de la plateforme de recherche Realities of Algorithmic Warfare à l'Université d'Utrecht aux Pays-Bas. Elle est également membre expert de la Commission mondiale sur l'utilisation responsable de l'IA dans le domaine militaire. Ses recherches actuelles portent sur la légitimité des opérations de ciblage militaire à la lumière de l'autonomie croissante dans la guerre, avec un accent particulier sur la protection des civils dans les conflits armés. Jessica est également juriste et praticienne renommée pour les questions liées à l'usage de la force, en particulier dans le contexte de la guerre des drones, ayant travaillé dans ce domaine pendant plus de 15 ans. Elle est membre du conseil d'administration There Wars, une ONG spécialisée dans l'utilisation des données ouvertes pour documenter les violences et les crimes de guerre. Ceux qui ne la connaissent pas, je vous encourage fortement à aller explorer ce qu'ils font comme travail. C'est très, très riche, très intéressant. Et rédactrice en chef du blog de droit international Opinio Juris. Donc, Jessica va nous présenter ses recherches sur l'IA et le ciblage militaire. C'est un enjeu qui est de plus en plus pressant, de plus en plus criant. Je suis sûr que vous en êtes conscient. Mais je me permets quand même de rappeler que l'IA militaire est dans un processus actuellement très rapide de normalisation. Les technologies sont développées depuis plusieurs années, une bonne dizaine d'années au moins par les Américains, notamment par l'armée américaine. Mais on retrouve une utilisation actuelle, très réelle, dans les conflits actifs. Donc, pensons à l'Ukraine et aussi au conflit en Israël, à Gaza. Donc, des pressions militaires, des pressions de défense, mais aussi des pressions commerciales et politiques sont très fortes pour favoriser l'accroissement de leur usage. L'IA militaire est souvent comparée, vous l'aurez peut-être déjà entendu dans d'autres circonstances, à l'arme nucléaire. C'est pas pour dire que l'IA militaire va permettre de faire exploser des choses. Hein. L'IA n'est pas une bombe, contrairement à la bombe nucléaire, mais la comparaison tient plutôt à la façon dont la nouvelle intelligence permettrait de transformer la pratique de la guerre. Donc, malgré toutes ces promesses énormes, l'IA militaire n'est évidemment pas sans risque, ni sans problème, mais c'est pas moi que vous êtes venu écouter, c'est plutôt notre invitée, Jessica Dorsey. Donc, without further ado, I will turn the mic to her and ask you to welcome her with me. Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for having me, and thank you also, of course, to our colleagues at CRITIC, Chantal Lavallée, who invited me here, but then it's such a gift to get to talk with another group of scholars and people. But before I get into the subject, I have an administrative announcement I'd like to make. You can hear in my voice I have a certain accent from a bit south of here. I'm American and Dutch, and I just want to say about the 51st state stuff. I mean, I'm sorry, désolé. And I thought, well, if I'm going to apologize, I wish that I just feel horrible about this scenario. I understand there's a lot of anxiety about the current geopolitical situation, and I wondered if there was something I could do for you, something I could give to you. So I thought about a gift. I didn't know how many people would be here, so I thought I'd give you a little gift of wisdom, a little free life advice. If you remember nothing from today to take away, I made this meme for you about a free life advice. If you're discussing any kind of classified military operations, try not to do it on Signal, okay? Unlike some of our neighbors to the south. I'm making light of something. I call it the orange elephant in the room. It's not something to be made light of. It's a very serious situation, and I'm cognizant of that, but I couldn't take an opportunity to speak to a room full of Canadians without mentioning something. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about other light topics, war, and Autonomous machines. Okay, so basically what I'd like to do today is talk through some of these technological developments, as Simon highlighted, and I try to couch this in reality, right? And that's what he mentioned. I direct a program called The Realities of Algorithmic Warfare, because there's a lot of discussion in every sector that involves anything to do with AI about futurism. This is the thing that this technology might be able to do one day, or one day it could, and perhaps it should, and maybe it will. That is also true, and I think it's important that we think about the potential things that it can do. But in this context, with respect to armed conflict, I think it's equally, if not more important, to understand what it is doing now. So understanding that right now there is a reality of a growing reliance on advanced militaries, but also not so advanced militaries, and also non-state actors. Everybody's trying to get their hands on this kind of technology, develop it, toy with it, and integrate it into their practice of military engagement. And there's becoming a growing reliance on these systems. And we talked about the AI-enabled decision support systems. In a slide after this, I'll get to the definition, how I'm talking about this particular technology. And because that there's such a growing reliance on it, there's also a rhetoric around it that these are just merely support tools. These are things that humans are using to help them make decisions. And in essence, that is true. They are there to help process or collect large amounts of data, and they feed into decision-making processes. But my issue with this framing is that I think there's something a bit more insidious going on. Namely, it's not just assisting us humans in making decisions, but I think that we're seeing indications that it can also change the way we make decisions and change the way that we humans interact with machines. And then the question of control comes up. Who is in control of these kinds of decisions? And why that's important. It's important in every sector that humans retain some sort of cognitive judgment or control over particular decisions, but certainly in context where the question implicates life and death decision making. So the way I focus on this is at what we term the sharp end of the stick. I look at how these systems are being integrated within the joint targeting cycle. So in conflict where people are being targeted, where countries are dropping bombs on people or places, how are decisions being made in order to drop those bombs? And how are AI-enabled decision support systems being integrated into those processes? And I think most of the focus generally, because this framing has been, these are just tools, there's nothing really to see here, we don't need to regulate them, in the same way that a lot of the oxygen in the room has been taken up by fully autonomous weapon systems. So anybody who's familiar with this discussion has heard the term, I don't love to use it, but I'm going to anyway, the killer robots discussion is about these big, awful machines that are going to come and take over cities and kill all of us. Nobody wants that. That's not the reality. No military I've spoken with finds that actually desirable because of the lack of explainability, traceability, and reliability of those systems. So we're kind of headed toward a world in which most general powerful militaries are getting to the point where they're agreeing we don't want fully autonomous systems, but that's where the discussions, certainly at the international level, have been for the last 10+ years within the context of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons at the United Nations, the Group of Governmental Experts on Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems, very big acronyms, the GGE laws. So most of the attention is focused on that particular subset of autonomy at the expense of having discussions about these other kinds of systems that are feeding in and becoming more and more integrated in war fighting. But what am I talking about? I'm talking about these within, as I mentioned, the joint targeting cycle. So I want to introduce that topic. So this is very like inside baseball or inside hockey. I guess I should change my sport reference in this particular country. So understanding that within a military, this is something called the joint targeting cycle. It's taken from NATO doctrine, or the United States also uses this. Every country that uses kinetic weaponry to target individuals or objects has its own version of a joint targeting cycle, but I find this one very helpful because what I wanted to do is understand where within these steps of targeting individuals or things, where decisions were being made and by whom. And then how were we trying to farm out some of that decision making to machines like AI-enabled decision support systems. So these are the various states in which militaries make decisions on, first they decide what are our end state, what are our objectives here? Do we want to eradicate an ism, a terrorism, or a particular group? Are we going after a particular combatant or a non-state actor? And once you've decided that, then you can move through the steps within the targeting cycle. Who is affiliated with this? So we could call those people legitimate military targets, or buildings, or bomb-making factories. Those kinds of things become legitimate military targets. Then we understand what capabilities we may have or may not have. What's in our arsenal? What kind of bombs do we have? What kind of artillery? What kind of forces might we have on the ground? What are our capabilities in order to engage the target? At step 4, this is where this is very relevant for this particular article and the proportionality analysis under international humanitarian law, because this is where the commander makes the decision and gives the green light or the red light about targeting those individuals. So this right here is the decision-making process I'm most focused on for this particular article, but I've done other work where we've looked at the entirety under the principle, for example, of precautions in attack, the requirement to take all feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm. That also has a relationship with proportionality, but here I'm looking at this idea of the reasonable military commander and what she has to do to make a decision and how these support systems might be feeding into that. Okay, so what are they? They are tools, like we mentioned earlier. It's in the name. They are AI enabled, so they use AI techniques to analyze data, provide actionable recommendations, and assist decision makers situated at different levels in the chain of command to solve semi-structured and unstructured decision tasks, okay? So they can be used in a variety of ways. They're very flexible. They can be set in to help you develop and prioritize your targets. This is what we've been seeing in reports. It's very difficult, I want to say that at the outset, my comments that I make about any use by the IDF, which I will probably reference because I've done a deep study into what we know publicly about what Israel has been reported to be using, is very difficult to establish veracity, certainly not to the level of like criminal responsibility, because we just don't know enough about the systems. That's also by design. Many militaries are not transparent with the kinds of tools or techniques they're using for a variety of reasons, some which are defensible, others of which are just in contrast to international law. That's a different path, but I want to say at this target development and prioritization, the systems that you may have heard of, Lavender, and the gospel, and where's daddy, these are terms that have been in the public media. These are systems that have helped with target development and prioritization. The idea is that they have a huge amount of data that they've collected through various sources, and that feeds into a database essentially, and it spits out a glorified Excel spreadsheet with names and scores between 0 and 100. And the higher your score, reportedly, the higher of a priority you would be for targeting, okay? This has spit out a list of reportedly 37,000 names to work through. So we're talking about huge numbers, huge scale, because as we know, in every sector, AI is an accelerator, right? AI helps us do more in a shorter amount of time. And that can be really helpful in a lot of different ways. But it can also be really harmful if you employ it for different means. So what, just to compare that as in numbers, I don't like to do numbers, I'm a lawyer after all, but what used to take the IDF 2 years' time with just plain humans running the show, so to generate 100 targets took them 2 years, and reportedly that takes these particular systems 1 day. So they could generate 50 names in a list when it was just human sourced, and now that's coming out at twice the amount every single day. So that's giving you an indication from the reports how this has increased speed and scale. Okay, what do? They collect and they process data. They can help with, as I mentioned, the target identification and nomination. Nomination is something really interesting also from a decision-making perspective, because it's not just spitting out a bunch of names, it also spits them out affiliated with a score, right? That's 0 to 100. That ranks them. It suggests a sort of prioritization. And that has a cognitive effect on us. If you get a list of names of 10 great students in your class, but 3 who really stand out, those top 3 get the best scores, etc., that anchors particular ways that we think about them. These are heuristics, these are cognitive mechanisms that we use on a daily basis. But then if that kind of cognitive thinking process is being anchored by what these machines are spitting out, that is a huge shift in the way that war fighting has traditionally been done. And we just need to be cognizant of that. This enhances speed and scale. And I want to really hammer on the idea that the obsession with and the focus on speed is central to a lot of these discussions, okay? And this is not new. Militaries have always wanted the advantage over their adversary, and they will always continue to want that. If you're going to fight, you want to win. And oftentimes, if you can be the first actor, you can win faster or more decisive. So speed in and of itself isn't a value negative aspect. But when that becomes the goal, and that goal causes blind spots for other effects, I think that's where my main concerns arise, is that we're going after speed. I wrote a blog about it called The Need for Speed, conjuring up images of Tom Cruise, perhaps, that we're so fixated on being fast, and AI lets us be fast, and that's really, really seductive. And I understand that from an operational perspective. But and this is one of my recommendations I'll come to at the end, but I think we need to do a 360 around what the costs of that speed are, and it's not always net positive. And we know that from empirical studies in psychology anyway. The faster we make the decisions, there's a trade-off. The more mistakes we will make, sometimes it's okay to make those mistakes. You know, maybe it's not a huge deal, right? But when it's life or death on the line, I urge caution. They're being used, as I mentioned, the realities. They're being used in the Israel-Gaza conflict by Israel right now, Ukraine, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, the Houthis that are being targeted as we speak and as we're signaling out on our small group chats. There is a particular AI decision support system called Project Maven that has been tested and is now in action by the Americans to collect, analyze data, identify targets, nominate them, and select and engage them as well. So that's a system that goes even a step further than the ones I mentioned earlier. They're being developed by advanced militaries as we speak. Canadians want them. Americans have them. Everybody wants them. And it's not just advanced militaries. This is the great equalizer, right? This is software. This is stuff you can program into very inexpensive technologies to make big effects. And so we're going to only see this increase. As I mentioned earlier, I'll kind of go quickly through this slide, but I think I really want us all to think critically about this narrative that they are just assisting us in making decisions. They do assist us, but they're also changing the way we think about war. And I think if we extract ourselves from the war context, if we think about other tools we use on the daily, right? Like I don't get places, generally speaking, without opening Google Maps. I'm very reliant on that system. Maybe some of you can relate to this. I don't think that I would be completely lost if somebody handed me a paper map. I think I could manage, but that's a cognitive skill that I've kind of offloaded, right? And that's probably fine, because generally if Google Maps has it wrong, there isn't a life or death decision on the line. Same thing is with like a calculator. That's not even an AI-enabled system. That's a computational method. We use calculators all the time. I'm maybe more than many of you, because I don't love math, as I mentioned. When's the last time, if you used a calculator to do a math problem, did you check the math on your calculator? Has anyone ever done that? I don't think any. Why would we, right? We can rely on it. We understand. We've used it. We're comfortable with it. We trust it. And the risk is low. Like calculator, if it got it wrong, which we don't know because we don't check our math, if it got it wrong, nobody's going to die because of a wrong math problem. Not directly anyways, okay? So I'm just trying to get us to think about some of these examples in a way that's relatable. Because they've only been framed this way, there have been less regulatory scrutiny, and I've mentioned some of this already. I think that they are changing the way that we commanders, humans, are thinking in war, and I think we need to understand that more fully. There's starting to be much more of a movement, certainly within academia, but also we're trying really hard also to place it on the agenda of the United Nations, so international discussions at the United Nations General Assembly. In May, we're submitting a civil society report to urge the Secretary General to take these kinds of things up in a more meaningful way, in addition to the work that's being done already on the fully autonomous weapons. I don't think we should stop thinking about the fully autonomous weapons systems. There's a lot of lessons in the last last 10 years of discussions that can be transferred into this space. So it's not that we need to just completely silo these two things, but we need to integrate the discussions about them much more. One final remark before I get a bit deeper into the proportionality stuff is that I want to highlight that it's not, I don't stand up here, I'm fairly agnostic actually about technology and modalities of war. I've been in the space of drone warfare for 15 plus years. I've focused a lot on how the United States was using it, using this modality to fight terrorism, as global war on terror, and how the drone warfare kind of morphed into and now has become integrated with the autonomous discussion is kind of how I got here. And I was never anti-drone. I still am not anti-drone. I don't think I'm anti-much, maybe anti-Trump, but don't tell anyone. They'll find out on their own. And I'm not anti-AI in military. I see a lot of utility for AI in certain context within the military, just like any other sector. But what I think is very important to point out here is that this is a bifurcated issue. So the tech, I will come back to it, but the first problem, and this is sketched by the International Committee of the Red Cross, comes out every 5 years with what they call the Challenges Report. And last September, they published a Challenges Report. In it, they outlined it, I think, perfectly. I write a different article. I call it the warification of law. It's the interpretation, essentially. The protective effect of the law is being undermined by how certain states are interpreting core concepts of law, okay? These interpretations broaden the notion of who or what can be targeted, and they expand and narrow those definitions of military objective and civilian. So when you start out by saying that the category of civilian, who we can never target intentionally, that's illegal, but that is so narrow as to leave the remainder broadly open for targeting. This is how those protective mechanisms that are built into the law shift. Okay, so the first problem, this is also what we saw certainly with the drone warfare, and this is how this kind of morphed into it. It's about how they were being used, how it lowered the threshold to use force, how force became, the targeting became this category of terrorist. We still have not agreed upon an internationally acceptable definition of terrorist. It's like art, you know it when you see it. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's whoever we want to call a terrorist, and therefore we can translate that into this idea of a legally legitimate military target. And I've pushed back on that in several fora. I continue to do so. What this does is make civilian casualties more acceptable in the eyes of the law. And they also hollow out, again, those protective mechanisms like the principle of precautions and the principle of proportionality. If you anchor your acceptance level of civilian harm per legitimate target at 0, that's a different anchor than if you say, well, we'll accept 20 civilians for the death of this person. Right? So you understand if that's your starting point, how then the knock-on effects might differ. So how that relates to the second prong, which is the bifurcation, the technologies, is that AI and AI-enabled systems, it's a mirror of us. We program these systems. We humans are in charge of using these systems. We use them in a way, if we understand the law or the legal contours of where we can use them, it will only serve to exacerbate existing problems, and that will happen in this context at speed and scale. So this is how we get to this discussion about how Gaza looks like, what it does. They talked about this stuff in the context of precision warfare. And I don't know about you, but when you look at pictures of Gaza or Ukrainian cities that are completely decimated, it's very difficult to understand precision to mean anything that was in the service of protecting civilians. So I wanted just to highlight that so that I see it as a two-pronged problem. It's not just because we have technological developments. Okay, so I don't want anyone to walk away and say, yeah, that Dorsey came in and said AI is bad. I didn't say that. I don't think it is. I think it can be really useful. But if you're using it in the wrong way, you're going to use it in the wrong way at speed and scale, and people will suffer and die because of that in the context of armed conflict. So this is a rule of proportionality for those of you who don't know it. There's proportionality all over the place in different areas of law, different norms, different frameworks. But in international humanitarian law, the laws of war, It's enshrined as a rule in the additional protocol. It's also customary international law, meaning it's binding on all parties. You cannot attack if the expectation before the attack, it's not afterwards, and that's oftentimes in the media kind of lost in the discussion. It's not, oh, there's a lot of civilians who are dead, therefore illegal attack. It's not as simple. But what you understand before the attack is that you're required to minimize to the greatest extent feasible civilian harm, and you weigh the expected concrete and direct military advantage that you expect against the anticipated civilian harm. It's a weighing exercise. And I hope you can already start to see this requires really advanced cognitive abilities to understand the chaos of a war zone, understanding the dynamic and chaotic nature, certainly in densely populated areas where a lot of conflicts are that we see today. It's different in an open field, let's say, when there's only combatants around, but in a densely populated urban area where civilians are transient the entire time, you have to be very careful about what you're weighing. If you want to target someone who is in a building A, but that is a high-rise apartment building filled with families and civilians, they're not targetable. So if you want to go after that particular individual, you need to find a way to do it to minimize, to the greatest extent feasible, civilian harm. You have an obligation to do that, right? And that's what the proportionality assessment is. But that changes, certainly in dynamic targeting scenarios, when people are walking in and out in these particular contexts, that requires really, really advanced cognitive thinking skills. And it's a weighing exercise. It's subjective analysis every time. And in law, we term this the reasonable commander standard. That's the level at which, and that's very, very vague, of course, who's the reasonable commander, what's she look like, have you ever met her, I don't know. But understanding what a reasonable military commander would do in that time is the standard at which we measure it. Why I think it's important to use that framing, that's what the law talks about, that's the jurisprudence has pointed to the reasonable military commander standard. Reasoning is something we humans do. Not always great, not always the best. Sometimes we make cognitive mistakes. We all make mistakes. We're human, after all. So I never like to get into the discussion, well, the machine can do it better than the human, or the human will do it worse than the machine. That's not what this is about for me. This is about the residual obligation that humans need to retain control over military operations. And in order to do that, that requires cognitive faculties that computers do not possess, and for many researchers will never possess. They cannot understand the context of a battlefield in the way that we humans can, based on experience of commanders, etc., in the field, right? They have to rely on intuition. All kinds of different factors go into these decisions, and it's very important that we retain control over these systems. How we got to this place where we are integrating almost seamlessly these AI decision support systems, I follow a trajectory which I term the quantification logics within targeting. And understanding how we got here, it didn't just happen at the advent of AI. We thought, let's plug that right in. There's been a longer tail, and that started, in my view, when we started this cost-benefit analysis sort of thinking. And you can kind of see how proportionality thinking, you are weighing two seemingly oppositional ideas. Expected military advantage of killing a target or destroying a building versus the anticipated civilian harm, the humanity aspect versus the military necessity. It's really difficult. Those two things are always in tension. There's never going to be a perfect answer, but here, when we start doing it, you can see that weighing, in other contexts, we weigh things like in cost-benefit analysis. There's economics that underpin this. It also has to do a lot with the Americans who are driving defense spending, operations, etc., and the place in the 80s and the 90s of economic thinking, cost-benefit analysis, starting with Ronald Reagan. Two scholars, Gunneflow and Knoll, have an incredible article really laying this out. So I start from that perspective, that if we're going to talk about cost-benefit analysis, what kind of elements are part and parcel of that? And I trace this also back to a doctrine that underpins American military thinking, but other Western allies, which is that of network-centric warfare. The idea that we can connect all the data, we can collect it, and we can connect it. And it's about connecting everything to everything else. The idea that it will help us accomplish our objectives more efficiently, faster, with fewer troops in harm's way. Okay, this is the doctrine that underpins this idea. The more data that we have, the better situational awareness that we can have, which I follow, and I also agree. It's important to see what you're dealing with in order to make decisions to achieve your military objectives. Again, very agnostic about technology and collecting data, except for insofar as it can have knock-on effects to human rights violations and surveillance and data protection, but that's a day. I'll come back for that lecture next time. So understanding, you see this is a piece from 2005. This really was at the heart of the Iraq War, the War on Terror, and then this creeps into other allies' doctrines as well. Understanding we need more data, we need to connect it so that we can be more efficient and faster, right? So you're seeing the theme here, right? What can make us faster, what can make us have the edge? We also use quantification logics already for a long time in this something called the collateral damage estimation methodology. These are computer programs that were meant to help understand how big of a blast radius a bomb would have. For example, if you knew the weight of your bomb and you knew that you dropped it at a particular altitude on this particular day in these particular conditions, this is how big your crater would be. And this is the radius that would be affected by it. Okay? Again, not a huge deal if you're out in an open field against tanks or combatants, but quite a big deal if you're dropping a 2,000-pound bomb in the middle of a crowded city. You're going to have different considerations, right? But we developed computer software with a horrific name, in my view. It was called Bugsplat. It generated, this was 2003 when this story broke, so I don't know exactly when the Americans started developing this software, but it came from the intention of trying to get a better grip on minimizing civilian harm. That's the intention that it came from. They wanted to know better how their bombs would act in a battlefield and understanding that by mapping it out, okay? So this particular software generates blob-like images that model the potential damage from specific bombs. And understanding, like calling it Bugsplat, it already inherently has dehumanization within it. Understanding that the blobs are human lives. They're understanding that those dots on the computer screen implicate dead civilians, right? Understanding that and already distancing yourself by calling it Bugsplat rather than anything else. Anyways, this helped them, this was in the Washington Post in 2003, to allow commanders to fine-tune those attacks. Within that proportionality assessment, this was a tool that helped them try to get a grip on minimizing civilian harm. So again, the intention was there, but this also entrenched further these quantification logics, that we can map it out, that we can mathematically understand this. It's not a math problem. We're lawyers after all, right? No, I keep saying, I guess I'm okay at math. I'm coming across like I just don't do numbers, but I do. I just prefer words. The final thing I want to mention is this idea, another metric that was being used from a policy perspective called the non-combatant casualty cutoff value, NCV. The US introduced this. It was very prominent and prevalent within Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS. Again, from an intention to minimize civilian harm. So they identified a particular target, a mid or a low-level target, and they accepted a NCV of 0. Said, if we kill this person, we will not accept any civilian casualties. It was to minimize harm. For example, the reports state that Osama bin Laden, if you remember that guy, he had an NCV value assessed with him, coupled with him, of 30. So if they found Osama bin Laden in a crowded market space, they didn't, they found him in bed on a dialysis machine. But if they would have found him and there were 30 civilians around him, they would have accepted that as a number because of the high value nature of that target. The expected military advantage versus the anticipated civilian harm, the weighing. They tried to anchor it in these numbers, this quantification, the ability to, and this also creeps then into other allies. The Dutch used it for a while, or they worked in coalition with one another. This was the Operation Inherent Resolve was a coalition operation. So if the Americans set the parameters, other nations followed. The US abandoned this officially in 2018, But I think there are residual indications that it's still within the military culture. It's not an official policy. And I want to say something. The law does not require 0 civilian casualties. This did not come from a sense of a legal obligation. This came from the idea that they wanted to minimize, but what I think it did, and what also feeds into what I'll talk about in the next slide, is that this idea that it anchors your acceptable understanding of harm. It anchors it. If it anchors it at 0, great. That's very low. So you will not accept civilian casualties if you're going to target that individual. But in more recent terms, the reports of Israelis using, for low-level targets or people who might have been affiliated with Hamas, a number of 15 to 20 per low-level target. Some guy who maybe had a phone call with a Hamas operative, they would accept 15 or 20 civilians. And if that particular low-level target was located in a high-rise building with multiple families or multiple people, and there were 2 or 3 or 4 other guys in that same building that they had on their list, they would just start adding it up. 4 or 5 guys times 20, 100 people, the whole building, not a problem. And they said this is fully within the confines of IHL. This is in compliance with our legal obligations. Anticipated military advantage versus expected civilian harm. If you anchor your number at 20 versus 0, it already shifts the way that you make decisions about what your legal obligations require. Period. No other Western military, and I've engaged with many over the past 18 months, trying to make sense of some of these current conflicts we're seeing and how the civilian death toll can be so high. And no single military actor, at least these were all off-the-record conversations, this is something so outside the pale of what other countries would ever accept. No one has an explanation for this outside of the IDF. I don't know. They haven't called me up and asked me over to explain themselves. They don't need to. But what we're watching as observers is really worrying because it's really eroding these protective mechanisms of the law through the use of these particular technologies. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to get there for us, and then I'll be open for some questions and answers. But I want to show you some risks. I've highlighted some of these. The law doesn't require these numbers, but they were used out of a good intention. And of course, we all know the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, perhaps. So the way that these things have been now used in a different way has made it much more difficult to be a civilian in these particular situations. When we codify civilian harm, reduces ideas into like a math problem, but this also has that effect of minimizing humans to mere data points, right? The bug splat, right? The same kind of idea. And this is a dangerous thing because we're not data points. We're humans, all of us, living, breathing stories, walking with multitudes of experiences, and we should not be reduced to data points. I've said some of this already, so I'm going to speed through it. This fixing of a numerical value has knock-on effects, okay? It reinforces data-driven targeting practices. Again, these kinds of situations require subjective human analysis and cognitive reasoning. And data and algorithmic assessments can't do that for us. It really raises an existential question about what the place is of a human in the human-machine interaction that we're starting to see everywhere. 4 biases that I've identified, and I'm going to actually go down this. This is early days with my article, but I see the value in, I'm not a psychologist myself, but engaging with cognitive psychologists. So I have some meetings set up to understand these a bit more in depth, to understand we're seeing indications of automation bias in the reporting. What that is humans over-trusting. It was my example that I said about the Google Maps, over-trusting. Right? Because we've learned to trust it and it's always going to give us the right answer, so we just act sort of as a rubber stamp for the recommendations, or we just follow Google Maps blindly, whether or not it leads us off a cliff. I hope it doesn't. Be careful with Google Maps. This anchoring bias, I've also highlighted that already. If you start with accepting already cognitively 20 is okay, it shifts your entire understanding of civilian harm like, severely, just absolutely off the map. And this matters within that joint targeting cycle when the commander has to make her decision. It can also lead to what I mentioned about our calculator example, our Google map. It can lead to cognitive de-skilling. So in case the AI falls out and the computers are off and the commander still has to make that call, but she's learned to only trust the system, she doesn't know how to do it herself, then we have a real issue. How is she going to make that call if she's de-skilled herself, or that we've allowed that to happen over time? So the importance of training and being prepared for human control over this stuff is really important. And finally, that idea of cognitive offloading, the fact that we never check our our calculators. We don't check the math, we just assume, right? And that is cognitive offloading. Those are heuristics, those are things that we do, those are shortcuts, it makes our lives easier. But in these contexts where the risk is so high to life and death, I don't think cognitive offloading is what we need to be aiming for. So my final slide here before I open it up is a set of recommendations that I'm kind of starting to put together. And I think these are meant for all different audiences. This is a multi-stakeholder discussion. It's not just for the lawyers. It's for everybody. It's for the technicians. It's for the operators. But the first one is that we need to make sure that these kinds of systems remain aids and assist us. They don't become decision makers, where we flip roles and that we're just the rubber stamp to what the machine is suggesting. We need to understand what we're giving up when we gain speed. We know this empirically. Cognitive psychologists have been telling us the whole time, you speed it up, you're going to make more mistakes. In some cases, it's okay. Mistakes are not fatal. But in this context, mistakes are fatal, and they're fatal to people, the civilians, who should not be at the receiving end of your fatal mistake. This requires training. Okay, so we have to understand first we need to understand the problem, or the problematization of what's happening, a 360 of what we gain but also what we give away, and how to mitigate some of those risks. So we have to do training, situational awareness, emphasizing the critical engagement with the output, not just the rubber stamping default moving through the list and getting through those 37,000 names. We have to critically engage with it, right? We need to check our calculator's math. No, we don't. But in this, we do. We need to build in institutional safeguards, so this also has a knock-on effect with private companies that are developing some of these tools, militaries who are developing these tools. What kind of safeguards are in place to validate and verify AI-generated recommendations? If you're not thinking about that throughout the entire life cycle of your AI system, you're doing it wrong. And if you're not sitting together with your legal advisor throughout that entire process, you're also doing it wrong. And I don't just say that because I'm a lawyer and I need job security, but because it's important that you're thinking through what the knock-on legal effects may be down the line when you start fielding these particular technologies. We need more insight into how these machines operate. We need more transparency and explainability in the systems themselves. Machine learning models, deep learning systems, many have heard this term, the black box, understanding that you put something into it, you have an input, you see the output, but you're not quite sure how those two things are related because you have no insight. It's opaque in the middle. There's no way to trace back how something, because we know in war things will go wrong, you don't know how they went wrong if you can't see what happened between the input and the output. So there needs to be more transparency and explainability built into these systems before we start fielding them. And this comes from a conversation I've had recently with a fairly high-level retired general from the US Air Force who's active in this space and developed a lot of these particular programs when they were first conceived. And he said, you know, warfighting is an art and a science. Okay, the science is important, the technology behind it is important, and we need it for warfighting. That's a reality that we're wrestling with. But the art, the commander's responsibility in decision-making needs to be within the purview of human control rather than giving it away to the machines. And so this is the focus on human intuition, strategic cognitive reasoning, preventing that erosion of cognitive skills because we're becoming too reliant on these AI systems. And finally, the integration of policy and legal oversight. This is crucial no matter what kind of technology you're using to fight wars. This is something I've been calling for and not only me, but other UN special rapporteurs, any kind of critical evaluation, is we need more transparency and we need more accountability. When things go wrong, as they will in war, it's messy, the fog of war. But there needs to be a way to trace back what went wrong and to correct it for the future operations, right? So it needs to be an iterative process. If things go wrong, as they will, find a way to be able to account for that, okay? And they have to align with your legal obligations. IHL is important when you're fighting war. And this also means you have to conduct periodic evaluations on how these technologies are changing the way we are fighting. I think I'll just leave it there. I'd like to open it up for questions or comments, concerns. Thanks.
On ouvre la période des questions. Merci. Thank you, Jessica. It was very, very interesting. Fantastic presentation. Very informative. Slightly frightening, but it's also why we're here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually wanted to ask a question about your recommendations. Have you seen any initiative on actually integrating into the algorithms IHL, so to actually make sure that the system itself actually considers the rules of IHL and other regulations or policy that are being developed by advanced militaries or other military institutions? Yeah, I just wanted to know if you've encountered that.
Yeah, there are many applications that are being developed that actually can help minimize civilian harm. So take facial recognition software, right? What we use on our cell phones to perhaps open them or transfer money. That same technology can also help build profiles. It requires data, so there are, again, human rights implications, but understanding that if it can help give a better situational awareness, that you have a particular person in mind that you've targeted or you have as a legitimate military target, and facial recognition software can help identify that that's not that person, that can also be quite a helpful way of respecting legal obligations outlined within IHL. On the flip side of that is, of course, IHL isn't the only legal framework, as I've just mentioned. These systems require massive amounts of data. So in order to build a profile like that, you're going to have surveillance. I mean, and we're seeing it like everywhere. Privacy considerations are fully within the purview of human rights law. That is not, IHL does not speak about data protection. So this is the lex specialis, so the idea that human rights law governs this space, and we need to be having many more conversations about, for example, this idea of a system of systems approach, where one system is the sharp end of the stick, the targeting bit, but everything else that fed into it, it's an AI decision support system or a suite of surveillance technologies that have biometric profiles of individuals, for example, after decades of surveillance in a particular area. There's a database that's then fed into or connected to another system for targeting. These are conversations that are really nascent and really, really urgent. So we need to be pushing that higher on the agenda. So to your point, can systems recognize or adhere to, can we build it into systems? You can.
Or at least share considerations to be like, for example, okay, here's the output that I'm giving you, but these are also the risks associated to the sorry, not the input, the output. Yeah, if you.
We can program a lot of stuff, yeah, but these are choices that we make. Right? We could be more precise. These weapons allow for a lot of precision, but that's not the reality that we're seeing, right? So I think it's about also policy choices and how those interact, and those are not within the full purview, unfortunately, of the law, but rather the political realities with which we have to wrestle. And there have to be, if there's a sense that we're using systems in a way that's contrary to IHL or human rights law, then there need to be knock-on effects from other states pressuring, or, for example, stopping sending weapons in particular situations, right? In the Netherlands, we have an ongoing legal case about the Netherlands' role in providing parts to Israel for the F-35 airplanes. The idea was that there was clearly established a risk, and that's the threshold. It doesn't have to be to establish the veracity, but that there's a risk of IHL violations, and that's enough under the Arms Trade Treaty and European profiles to require you no longer to send particular technologies. But that's being contested and time is passing, etc. So these are examples of the law is clear. The law can be programmed into some of these systems, but it's about that sort of the bifurcated issue I mentioned. If your interpretation of the law is X and you program that into your machine, that is just going to be a reflection of what we've programmed into it. So I think it's about policy choices and design choices that we are programming these systems. This is still within human agency. So we just have to make better choices and talk about it more, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
We have a question from a person online, so I'll ask the question to you. Do you think the Trump administration has modified the NCV that is acceptable?
Do I think that they've modified it?
Yeah.
Look, the U.S. said as a policy measure in 2018 that they've stopped using it. I haven't seen an official announcement that they've brought it back in any particular meaningful way. What I have seen is a number of things, one of which is we have a Secretary of Defense who has promised more lethality. We have a Secretary of Defense who has sacked the highest echelons of legal advisors who were meant to be apolitical actors to at least give measured legal advice about what the obligations are under IHL and other legal regimes. And we've seen the subsequent firing of other individuals who were not of that same persuasion. So understanding that maybe they don't have an NCV, but they have a focus on lethality, that translates through. Just to be very concrete about it, I made a joke about Signalgate, right? But that strike on the 15th of March that the whole kerfuffle was about is just the first step. And every single day, it was on the New York Times website this morning, every single day since then, there have been strikes every single day. We're not talking about that. We're talking about Signal. And should they have used a skiff, or shouldn't they have had that conversation? Or can you believe those weird emojis? I get it. I understand, because it's just so outside of whatever the range of normal was, right? I get why we're talking about that, but we also need to be focusing on the real civilian cost here. 53 people died on that strike, some of whom were civilians. And I'm, full disclosure, I sit on the executive board of an NGO that's based in London called Air Wars. Air Wars is a civilian harm monitoring organization. They started in 2014. They're a bunch of investigative journalists, so they're not lawyers, but they basically monitor and document civilian harm based from airstrikes, essentially, hence the name, Air Wars. They've monitored Syria operations, Russian operations, American operations, other coalition allies in the past in Iraq and Syria, but since 18 months, they've been focused almost solely on the events in Gaza and the ripple effects. So also the Yemen attacks fall under their purview. They have been able, since yesterday I was in contact with the director, they've been able to evaluate that at least, and this is the lowest possible number, it's going to be more than it is ultimately, but of those 53, at least they've confirmed 15 of those people were civilians. You can go to their website and learn more about that. They have a transparent methodology, etc. So I think placing this in the larger context to the question whether or not they're using an NCV, if we go back to the if I can zoom back to my, sorry about this, is going to be a little annoying. Let me get to the slide where I show you the joint targeting cycle. Here, the end state commanders and objectives, that policy anchor, which is more lethality, if that's your policy goal, or if your policy goal is eradication of an ethnicity, if your policy goal is the complete obliteration so as to render it uninhabitable of a particular area of ground, if your policy goal is to gather back portions of other countries or to perhaps annex or take by force Greenland or Canada, if that's your policy goal, everything after that happens. And if you're gonna do that with more lethality, I think these are the knock-on effects that we have. And so in that sense, quantification logics also extend to that, but it's more just like lethality logics. Also, Pete Hegseth, the Minister of the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, has said also in the past that we should remove ourselves from the Geneva Conventions. We should no longer let international anybody else tell us what to do, essentially is what it comes down to. These are really worrying times. This person has a horrifyingly large amount of power and a huge organization that he's directing, unless he's been fired. I don't know, I haven't checked in the last 50 minutes what's happening there. So we should be concerned, and we should be concerned, we should focus on actually not the moving goalpost or the shiny thing over here or the signal emojis. It's funny, but also the real focus should be how we are warring and who we are killing. So that was a very long answer to a yes or no question, probably. So you get when you ask a lawyer to come and talk, right? But I thank you for coming. Merci beaucoup. Who else has something? Comment? Question? Maybe you find what I had to say completely ridiculous, and you can also say that. I'm welcome to feedback. Yes, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation.
Sure.
I was wondering, I feel like there is a tendency to move focus from fundamental issues, human rights issues related to AI in general, to other issues or to other narratives. So you spoke about the fact that we hear a lot about killer robots, for instance, fully autonomous killer robots, or a general tendency to talk about a fully autonomous system in general and how they can pose a risk for humanity or take control of everything. So I'm wondering how do you see that? Like how, if it's a strategy, and from who and how do you see that? And also, I'm wondering how we could bring back or bring the focus on fundamental issues and keep it also on those issues.
Big questions. I'll try to be concise with my answer. To your point about the killer robots and the focus on that, I think this sort of was born from a civil society movement to get some focus on it, and to call something a killer robot attracts a lot of attention. We all have sci-fi images of what that conjures. In the beginning, that was really helpful from an advocacy perspective to get attention focused on it. If you get people worried about it, you can galvanize public attention and then turn policymakers' heads, and that worked in the beginning. And in fact, that's how the whole process going on at the United Nations CCW-GGE laws was born, right? Focus on, okay, we've got to do something about this threat, this looming threat. This may happen. We should prevent it from happening. Fast forward 10 years, it's no longer helpful. And that's why I also kind of did it with a sigh or a slight eye roll. Anybody in this particular field doesn't like that terminology. Even the civil society actors have, I mean, it's called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. They can't just abandon their name, but even campaigners are like, yeah, it's not really helpful. Because it's so much more than just killer robots. And again, no major military power, because of the lack of reliability and trust in these particular systems, nobody's really going after that. Nobody thinks they're reliable enough to field them. Okay? So where the attention, that has sucked up so much oxygen in the room. So I think this is why my call is, hey, there's a whole spectrum of autonomy here. We've got the killer robots over here that nobody that's not what we're talking about, right? We have this whole rest of the spectrum of autonomy that's happening now, and we don't have much of a grip on it. So I think my first call would be talk more about this stuff, ask more questions, engage with military actors or tech companies. How are you designing these, and where's the place of your legal obligations within this, or your policy, your ethical oversight? How are you doing this? And then, this is me delaying because I'm trying to recall the second portion of your question. What was it again? How do we, fundamental issues.
Yeah, just how could we bring back or bring the focus on more fundamental issues and keep it?
I think by being really nuanced in the conversation and talking about it at a level and understanding the systems. I think this is a real problem. I mentioned already, this is a multi-stakeholder discussion. It's not just for the lawyers. It's not just for the tech bros or gals or people, they, them, her, he, him. It is for all of us to be wrestling with. That is a difficult ask because I'm not technically inclined. I understand AI enough to talk about this stuff. I understand what machine learning is and some of these modalities, but I couldn't build it. I can't code, but I don't think it requires that we all become experts in all the fields, but I think it requires a willingness to engage at a technical level, not just the technical side of things, but at a level that requires understanding and an openness to hearing the perspectives from the multi-stakeholder approach. It's not just the law is clear, so this is why we talk about this in this way. That's not helpful, and we've learned that in other focus areas. So I think being open and having these conversations is really integral, because each of these communities around the table probably have a different answer to say, well, what are the fundamental issues? I have an answer as a lawyer who's focused on, minimizing civilian harm to the greatest extent possible. Then I come at that question with a different answer than a technician might, because maybe they're wrestling with how they program this kind of stuff. They didn't even know what IHL is until we started to engage with one another. I didn't even know the possibilities with machine learning and what sort of then iterative effects those can have. So, for example, one concrete example here, every country has the obligation when it acquires a new weapon or a mean or method of war to do a legal review to make sure that that new machine, technology, weapon complies or can comply with its intended use with IHL. It's called an Article 36 review. So weapons, means, or methods. Usually, in the past with conventional platforms, we knew, okay, this is a new bomb. Is it going to act in the way we intend it to act, and how do we know that? We've tested it, etc. And now we know how it's going to act, so we've done a review and it complies with law in these particular situations. But try to do that with technology that I have on my cell phone, but then used in a drone can select and engage individuals half a world away. How do you regulate that? How do you know? And in a machine learning context, when it's iteratively improving and teaching itself, or in systems of systems where machines are teaching machines, at what point does that trigger a new review? Those are questions we're trying to wrestle with right now, but that requires really technical levels of discussion. And the machines and the machine learning, it's moving faster than the law ever will. And we know that. The law is always behind. But it's hard to keep up with this stuff. So I think one other thing we can urge is for people to slow down. And no military wants to hear that because they want to have the edge, and they, but China or but Russia, but America. Yes, but also there is wisdom in understanding why we need to slow down, so we have a better understanding of how we're using these kinds of things. So that's a little bit of advice. I don't know if it's helpful.
Thank you.
Do you have some answers?
No, I thought about it in the context of my thesis, but and I'm working on discrimination in particular, AI and discrimination, and I realize it's the same kind of issue even outside of the military, and it's a more fundamental issue in the military because, as you said, of death issues. Yeah. But I came a little bit to the same conclusion that we need to engage. Organize, but I'm a little bit desperate by how it goes fast, how it's supported, how like the part of the stakeholders are really focused on going fast and developing fast. Yeah. And we need also those stakeholders to engage with us, but they're not really interested in that. So I
work with some other scholars in this space. I don't particularly focus myself on the role of private tech companies, but this is something that's fundamentally shifted with this kind of development in warfare, because usually it's been the conventional weapons like the Boeings and the Raytheons and those kind of big that are problematic for different reasons in certain ways. But here we have the Silicon Valley mentality, which is move fast and break things. And when you're moving fast and breaking things as a mantra, and the things in this case that you're breaking are actual humans, humans' lives, humans' well-being, their homes, their communities, that is in direct conflict with, again, the legal frameworks that we're talking about. So I get it, the struggle is real. I think having these conversations help in understanding that you're looking at it from the discrimination perspective. It takes a village. We all should be talking about it and working on it. I mean, there are billion things that are going on in the world right now that need our attention, but I think it helps when we don't feel so isolated. Exactly. So thanks for sharing your experience. Yeah.
And the question is, can this technology be, or is the technology used for law enforcement, search and rescue, or border security? Is it used for those? Yes. Can it be used, or is it used beyond military?
Yes, I can be very concise, yes. And we see this in other contexts as well. We see the sort of blurred lines between policing and military and policing. Certainly in our neighbor, your neighbor to the south, has been a very big, like the militarization of the police. These they flow across. There's a very nebulous idea, and then certain technologies, certainly with these particular things, surveillance technologies, bleed very easily into various purposes. And that's why they're so attractive and so seductive for militaries to want to use. If they're obsessed with getting all the data that they can in order to establish situational awareness or understand patterns of life, where people move, in order to track where that particular target may be, that requires data. And that idea of the system of systems approach that I've mentioned is that a huge database of names in a particular location would not be possible without mass scale of surveillance and human rights violations, a decades-long program. And that's, of course, you can probably understand I'm referring to the situation in Israel, but that's happening in all of our societies. I was kind of walking, this is my first time in Montreal, it's a really beautiful city. I was walking around kind of looking where the cameras were. I always find that interesting. I was in London not so long ago. Man, you can forget about privacy there. You're on CCTV. Hello, Mom. I'm on CCTV. Everywhere. It's very difficult not to be tracked. Everywhere we're going. And in different ways, and that's creeping in. And those are law enforcement rationale. But then, what are they doing with that data? And how will it be used against us? China is another example, right? The understanding of the kind of surveillance society that they've built, that's being used against people in law enforcement, but also in different kinds of contexts, right? Profiling particular ethnic groups, jailing them, torturing them, killing them. That's happening because of these same technologies, and they're very multi-purpose. And again, that's the seductive nature of why militaries want that. If you're after all the data, in order to have a better idea of your battlefield, you've got to get that data somehow, and those lines are very blurry. I tried to be short. The answer was yes, but then this is some more context there.
Okay, I'll ask for myself here. Okay.
Great.
Two questions actually, but so I'll try. You mentioned the black box. The AI is a black box earlier. Maybe I'm more pessimistic than you are, but since it is a black box, is it technically possible to really have a human play fail-safe and really assess the decisions that are made by a machine, since we don't know how they made it? So that is
the first one, black box. Okay, you want to ask the second one? I can.
Yeah. The second one is, you also mentioned the privacy issue that comes with trying to improve the AI. You know, the more we want it to be precise, the more data that we need to train it. So Silicon Valley is really looking into synthetic data as a way to counter this. Could it be an avenue for improving also military AI?
That's a great question as well. Okay, so the first one, black box. Look, again, this is where technical expertise is really important. I can't tell you the level of which, and every system has a different variation of how black the box is, how opaque the system is. I talked recently to somebody fairly high up in the UK government who has technical background but also a legal background, and she was talking more about gray boxes, that we're able to start seeing more and digging more into this idea of black box, so that it's becoming more and more transparent. And so there are sort of gradations of gray, is what she was saying. I thought of an article title, something like 50 Shades of Gray, but I thought maybe that's the wrong tone to set. But the idea is that we're starting to break open that black box in certain circumstances. So it's not as opaque as it perhaps was 10 years ago, but how transparent actually is it? So these same issues arise. So I think, can we ever know? If you can't know, you shouldn't field it. I think oftentimes in this discussion, militaries are forgetting that no is also an option. And no is not just an option because you might kill civilians, which is horrible, and militaries generally agree on that. But it's also operationally risky. It makes you vulnerable if you can't predict, the lack of predictability of what a system is going to do. And this kind of links, I think, to your second point about, what was your second question? Because this is linking to it, but I'm blanking. Synthetic data, yes. Because of the dynamic nature of a battlefield, and I'll get to that synthetic data in a second, but because of the dynamic nature, how, if you send out a machine that you think, because you trained it in a particular scenario, and then you put it in a very different scenario with different weather, or it's raining instead of the dry area we tested it in. I mean, like, these variables matter a great deal to these systems. And if you don't know how it's going to respond, and this is why militaries are trying to experiment with it, but oftentimes, like, they're experimenting in real battlefields, like Gaza, the Gaza laboratory, right? The Palestinian laboratory is what Anthony Lowenstein calls his book and his documentary. These people didn't consent to being lab rats. This is not but this is what's happening. We're seeing Silicon Valley, companies like Palantir, experimenting with human lives, seeing what it'll do. And that data that they gather feeds into the iterations to make their systems better. Then they sell them to other militaries who are not thinking about their own relationship to the data that's been plugged into that system and those Palestinians on whom it was tested. When you confront them, they haven't thought through this stuff. And that concerns me. So that synthetic data question, it's not a reliable indicator of how these particular systems will act in a very chaotic battlefield scenario. You can test to a certain extent some things on synthetic data, but if you can't recreate it and you can't predict what's going to happen when it's in a particular context, that has knock-on legal, ethical, moral issues that you need to be wrestling with. And this goes to that legal review question I said, like, it may perform in a certain way in dry conditions, but then it started raining and it went haywire and it couldn't see, the facial recognition software didn't work well enough to distinguish between a civilian and combatant. Well, now you have a really big legal issue. It's a lack of distinction. That's one of the core principles of IHL. You're not in compliance with, even though the indications were, in this particular situation, it could distinguish, right? So I think these are really complicated, layered issues that we have to sit down and unpack, and that takes time, and it's really in tension with this idea that we better hurry up and move fast and break things. And so I don't know the right answer other than we could try with synthetic data, but it's not going to give us the full picture. And before you field a system, you better be sure it's going to do what you intend it to do. And if you can't, no is also an answer. Yeah?
Thanks.
Yeah, I think synthetic data isn't going to help answer all of these questions, because synthetic data could perhaps feed into other systems that again, it's about the risk level, right? The idea is that if it's trained on synthetic data, that can never encapsulate all the scenarios you're going to encounter on a battlefield. Not that you're required to think through every scenario, but that synthetic data is not going to save us in this particular context. So let me be very clear about that. That's not going to be the answer here. And even breaking open the black box fully and being fully transparent, that's also maybe not going to save us. Like, we have to understand that it's so case-by-case basis that in a particular context, just like I said, in a very densely populated urban area, putting a system out there, deploying it there, has very different implications than it does in an open battlefield where only tanks are fighting and there are no civilians around, right? That's the same with respect to conventional platforms as well. It's not just AI specific. But when we're pushing towards this idea of fighting at machine speed, we're also trading in the ability to understand what we're doing, what kind of data we actually do need in order to make these machines reliable and predictable and explainable. I hope that sort of answers better the question. But I'd be open to hear if you have other thoughts on synthetic data.
I think it does answer very, very, very well. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome.